Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Jeffrey Grove. I'm the Whelan Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, and I welcome you to this lecture this evening by Alexander Nemerov. But first, I just want to mention our next program, which comes up 2 weeks from tonight and will be held in the same space. We're doing a program in connection with the Atlanta Contemporary Arts Center, and they have organized a show, my colleague Stuart Horodner, in response to Morris Louis Now, an American Master Revisited, and it's called Louis Morris, and it features the work of 5 younger artists who are some way addressing issues of abstraction and making of objects that relate to issues explored in Morris Louis's canvases. So next Thursday, we'll kick off with a tour at 7 o'clock. I'll take you through the Morris Louis exhibition. Then we'll come in here. 3 of the artists in Louis Morris will present their work, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So that'll be a lot of fun, and I hope you'll come back for that and bring someone. Now, I'd like to introduce Alexander Nemerov. He's one of the essayists for the catalog, which, if you haven't purchased your catalog yet, I hope you'll run out and get one after this because it's a really beautiful publication, beautiful reproductions of the work, and it includes 3 spectacular essays with new scholarship on Morris Louis. I almost called him Louis Morris. Alexander is a professor of art history at Yale University, where earlier in his life he took his master's and doctorate, and then after that he taught at Stanford University, where he was a professor in art history for 8 years before coming back to Yale, where he is now and has been since 2001, correct? And Alexander teaches and writes on a variety of issues dealing with American visual culture from the 18th century to the 1960s, as embodied in this essay. He's also the author of 3 books, Icons of Grief, Val Lewton's Homefront Pictures, The Body of Raphael Peale, Still Life and Selfhood, 1812 to 1824, and his earlier book, Frederick Remington and Turn of the Century America. And Frederick Remington was also the subject of Alexander's dissertation. He also writes numerous articles, and recently you'll be interested, in light of the Wyeth exhibition we had here last year, published an essay, The Boy in Bed, The Scene of Reading in N.C. Wyeth's Wreck of the Covenant. He also has an exhibition, Frederick Remington and the American Civil War, A Ghost Story, on view at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts through, it closed, October 29th. Alex's current project is a book on a single night's performance of Macbeth during Abraham Lincoln's performance. So Alexander's going to present his talk, and then we'll welcome questions and answers from the audience after that. So please welcome Alexander Nemerov.
Okay. Could I have the lights down, please? Thank you all. Thank you, Jeffrey, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's my pleasure to talk to you tonight about Morris Louis, and more especially about just one of his paintings. This one, the large 9 by 19 foot picture called Alpha Tau, one of the biggest of the many so-called unfurled pictures that Louis made in 1960 and 1961, a painting that's now in the Hayes exhibition here on loan from the St. Louis Art Museum. It's a meaningful picture for me, very much so, since I grew up in St. Louis. And it's one of the first paintings I actually have a distinct memory of. I recall it even now from my trips to the museum with my father as a boy. And so it's really a special honor to have written about this picture for the catalog and to be here tonight speaking about it to all of you. The challenge tonight is what to make of this painting, how best to answer to the claims it makes on us as viewers. How do we make sense of its sheer visual extravagance on the one hand, that bravura display of bright acrylic colors and that audacious center of empty canvas, and then on the other hand, how do we explain its austerity, its careful refinement, where no line goes awry, everything is carefully plotted, and the whole thing hangs together in marvelous symmetry? What do we make, in other words, of the picture's combination of excess and precision. What do we make, what do we make of the fact that Lewis made so many of these unfurleds, producing dozens in the short span of about a year? And this is a photograph of an installation of some of them at the Emmerich Gallery in New York City in 1964, 2 years after Lewis's death. What more than that do we make of the fact that Lewis was not the only one creating abstractions both exuberant and austere in those years? His friend Kenneth Noland was making pictures like this one called Morning Span, also in the early 1960s. And their lesser known but allied contemporary, the contemporary of Lewis and Noland, Paul Feely, was also at work on a comparable kind of picture, groovy, yet also aristocratically composed, like this one, Untitled, from 1963. What do we make of the fact that all these artists are working on this same kind of picture at the same time? There are art historical accounts about all this. There are always art historical accounts, and in this case they happen to be quite brilliant and persuasive ones, written by the critics Michael Fried and Clement Greenberg, accounts stressing the purely formalist power of this kind of art, the way it is abstract and only abstract, with no reference to the real world, so-called, outside itself. But tonight I'm more interested in looking at the work anew, in asking, along with the title of the Hayes exhibition, Morris Louis Now, what these pictures look like now that we can look back at them across 40 years of retrospect. And I'm interested in making a virtue of our limitation, then, of being so far removed from the time when these pictures were made, in saying that we can now see things about these works that were invisible to the critics, invisible even to the artists themselves. For me, when I look at Alpha Tau and these other pictures, I feel the culture and politics of the early 1960s. I see these pictures, all of them, not just Lewis's, but Noland's and Feely's, as well as the history paintings of their era. Not history painting in the sense of depicting actual personalities and events, but history painting in the sense of being theory-sanctioned representations of human feelings, writ large, petrified in ceremonial grandeur, the equivalent of older figure painting in which fixed, portentous gestures and expressions ritually convey heroic motion and emotion. I see these history paintings, so-called, more than that, as perfectly expressing the ideals of the Kennedy administration, ideals based on controlled portrayals of feeling modern and hip, but also dignified, so that Lewis, Noland, and Feely all deserve to be understood as the court painters of the Kennedy government, not literally, but in effect. So how, first, is Alpha Tau a kind of history painting? Well, the answer concerns the nature of Lewis's borrowings from abstract expressionism, like Jackson Pollock's number 7, 1951, there on the screen. We're dealing here with how these two artists portray feeling. Are pictures like Alpha Tau an elimination of expressionist displays of feeling like Pollock's, which is the canonical view? Or are they a kind of objectification or petrification of these displays of feeling, a way of showing the same signs of emotion except now in a more regal, dispassionate way? And the comparison you're looking at is a good place to rehearse both these accounts, starting with the canonical account, which says that Lewis borrowed from Pollock's works on unprimed canvas, such as number 7, 1951 there, that he derived his own monumental use of bare canvas and stained, soaked color from the example of Pollock via Helen Frankenthaler, but that he divested Pollock's works of all their Gothic psychology, their nervous delicacy and rage, and replaced that angst with the lightness, cheer, and above all, impersonality of a new kind of poured paint, the thinned acrylic made to flow down the bare canvas carefully as a result of calculation, not emotion. Lewis's work, then, in this view, as a disinterested art of lyric brightness that voids expressionism altogether, thus the canonical view. But the other way to see Lewis's art, and this is the way I'm interested in it, is as a showcase of the same Pollock-type signs of emotion, except now kind of cleaned up and presented with careful deliberation. The pores of paint, in other words, do not lose their capacity, drawn from Pollock, to signify emotional states. It's just that here, in Lewis's work, those signs of feeling are shown without feeling, impersonally. So the example of contour in each artist's work is a good place to see this. Pollock's lines, as here, are about a struggle to make order out of chaos, to pull the inchoate, the infantile, the palsied, and the trembling into some kind of tenuous order of delicacy. We have here in his picture a psychological drama, modern man struggling to lift sense, to make sense out of an ever-impinging chaos. Lewis's contours, on the other hand, and this is a detail of Alpha Tau's left side, are smooth and controlled, disinterested, not so much as a single guiding pencil mark exists or ever existed as a sign of the artist's expressive hand. But all the same, these contours preserve the various expressive possibilities of fluid twists and turns of pigment, like the ones in Pollock's picture. It's just that Lewis's painting shows these signs of expression unexpressively. A meditative, abstract expressionist. That's what the critic Lucy Lepard called Lewis in 1965. And there's something about that oxymoronic phrase, a thoughtful, careful expressionist, that captures this view of Lewis's art. Paintings that are not disinterested per se, but rather disinterested displays of emotion. And Noland is so much the same way. His chevron pictures from the early 60s, such as this one called Sarah's Reach, do not expunge abstract expressionist histrionics so much as turn that emotion into a grand and impersonal representation of itself. The critic Max Kozlov, writing in 1965, thought this was obvious when he observed that Noland's diagonals are, as he said, transparent displacements of what had previously been gestures in abstract expressionism. The diagonals for Kozlov emulate the gestures of, say, Willem de Kooning's outsized brushwork in the picture you're looking at on the right called Montauk Highway, except now with all the simulated psychology, all of this stuff here turned into a frozen heraldic emblem. If on the right there's a sign of potent emotion, a mark of the divine tantrum, as Kozlov described de Kooning's art, on the left there's a similar slashing diagonal, except now presented coolly, dispassionately. Abstract expressionist feeling is still fully present in Noland's work, except now in petrified form as an objectified sign. And a sign, too, not in a cynical philosophical sense, as in Roy Lichtenstein's famous brushstroke paintings of 1965, which in their own way objectify or freeze the gesture, but in a much more respectful relation, Noland's work, to abstract expressionism. One intent even on aggrandizing gestural feeling by preserving it. On the left, suspended and floating in crisp and purified forms, emotion codified, emotion illustrated. And the paintings of Paul Feely, a longtime Bennington College art professor, read in exactly this way, too. In the new works he began making in the early 60s, Fili tried for an art of static, unexpressive motifs, such as balustrades, barbells, and figure eights, as in this picture called Kratawera from 1963. Fili wanted to avoid, he said, all heart-on-the-sleeve effects. He wanted his laconic emblems and flat brushwork to make, in his words, no attempt to be exciting, like an expressive picture would, but just to sit still and have a presence. Yet here again, we could say that Kratawera, or this Fili painting from 1963, called Achernar, produce a sense of emotion not so much vanquished as frozen, petrified into big, bold shapes, recognizably abstract expressionist in their derivation. A contest, as one critic put it, these pictures were, between expression and design, between feeling and its rationalization, between a lyric impulse and a strictly articulated format. Affective elements, emotion, another critic wrote about Fili's work, are projected as structural principles, like design principles. That is, gestural expressiveness does not disappear but takes the form of these big, predetermined shapes, so that emotional swaths, like de Kooning's, remain, again, here, except in measured, calculated forms. Affective elements as structural or design principles, a structuring of affect. This description fits Lewis's work just as well. And it calls to mind, too, from a completely different kind of painting, the most interesting historical analog for the art of Lewis, Noland, and Fili, and the kind that can bring us back to John F. Kennedy, and that is the work of Charles Lebrun, the most famous theoretician of the legible, systematic representation of emotion. Lebrun, as court painter to Louis XIV from 1661 to 1690, Lebrun, who happens very fortuitously to be featured in the Louvre show here now, made vast history paintings like the one you're looking at, called The Queens of Persia at the Feet of Alexander, pictures dedicated to showing his belief that human emotions could be known and rendered scientifically. So in this painting, we see figures all down in here, contrite, grieving, anxious, hopeful, and surprised, and so on, before the great ruler and his near double Hephaestion. Faces and gestures in this picture are codified, cleaned up, presented neat and ceremonially for maximum legibility. Emotion is harnessed according to the rules of decency, as one art historian puts it, with crude nature now transformed by an ennobling exactitude of depiction, a science of the passions. Now, the comparison on the screen, though, between these two different ways of codifying emotions certainly raises more questions than it answers. What is it that I'm saying here with this comparison? Is it that I'm claiming a type of residualism in which the strategies of one kind of picture, this one down here from the 17th century, leave a faint but discernible impression on those of another, Lewis's up on top, so that Lewis's rivulets, for example, would be the vestigial recollection of the drapery swags in Lebrun's painting. The corner rivulets, just so, would abstractly emulate, say, the prostrate figure at lower right in Lebrun's work, the very personification of cornerness in a painting. And would I be saying that the whole drama in Lebrun's painting of left and right sides, left meeting right, in dialogue but apart, am I saying that this in Lewis's work would be repeating history painting compositions, his left and right there, so that Lewis's banks of color would be understood then as the trace of so many Lapiths and centaurs, Abrahams and Melchizedeks, or as here, Alexander and the Persians, two sides coming together, stage left, stage right, in conflict or kindness, so that the relation between the two paintings on the screen would break down then to just a kind of return of the repressed with grand narrative painting and its codified emotion re-emerging in faint but palpable echo in the midst of avowedly non-narrative abstract painting. Is that what I'm saying? No. Instead, I'm saying that Lewis's paintings are a remanifestation of history painting, of its grand scale and size, a remanifestation emerging really out of nowhere, in a flash from the past, in response to the exigencies of a cultural situation in the 1960s, structurally similar to the one that called into being the picture down there at the bottom. A situation calling for, even demanding, grand displays of ritualized emotion designed to celebrate state power. So that when the artist Frank Stella, in his book, Working Space, likens Lewis to the great 17th century court painter Peter Paul Rubens, designating each a kindred master of vast and encompassing pictorial spaces. And here is Alpha Tau in situ at the St. Louis Art Museum, showing just how big and Rubensian its imposing size and scale really are. Many of you, if not all of you, of course, have already seen it here and can judge for yourselves. When Frank Stella does this comparison to Rubens, we're to understand the link he makes, like the one I'm making tonight, not as the reference to an echo, a haunting, some kind of return of narrative art from repression, but rather as a full-bore reinvention of history painting in all its grandiosity and ritual depiction of the emotions in response to a cultural situation, calling for this type of work to manifest itself gloriously anew. And what was that situation? John F. Kennedy, first Catholic president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, fabled patron of the arts, a leader who even before he took office signaled that he would welcome an art, a modern art, celebrating his presidency. Kennedy, of whom the poet Robert Frost put it best at the inauguration in January 1961, when he predicted the Kennedy years would produce, as Frost wrote, the glory of a next Augustan age, a golden age of poetry and power, a dream, Frost's, best stated in the poem's opening lines, which go, summoning artists to participate in the august occasions of the state seems something artists ought to celebrate. Today is for my cause a day of days, and his be poetry's old-fashioned praise, who was the first to think of such a thing. It's a new age in America, Frost makes clear, a time when suddenly the old-fashioned mode of state patronage of the arts, the thing that had been for centuries the trend, is resurrected. Lewis, Noland, and Feely were not literally commissioned to celebrate the state like Frost, but each made an ambitious new kind of work in the early 1960s that somehow best portrayed the limited range of ceremonial emotions that embodied and gloriously celebrated the Kennedy administration. And I say this because their imagery of emanating rays, mandalas and aureoles of light, of new days dawning in dazzling expanses of bare canvas and prismatic color, matched the Kennedy rhetoric, the emphasis on sunny optimism and noble authority, hope and gravity, cheeriness and dignity. Pictures such as Alpha Tau and this untitled Feely painting, which is dated March 8, 1963, matched the Kennedy focus on radiant beginnings, a new frontier, as in Kennedy's inauguration speech with its recurrence of the word begin. So let us begin anew. Let us begin. And its emphasis on a light that will, quote, light our country and all who serve it, a belief that the glow from that fire, as Kennedy said, can truly light the world. an emphasis embodied, too, in Kennedy's commencement of the space program in 1961, with its iconography of orbits and stellar glows, so much in evidence in Feely's work, such as this one called Alniam. The work, too, Feely's was of a Catholic and a staunch Democrat painting in Bennington, Vermont, a few miles from the president's home state. In all this exuberance, too, to come back to Lewis, this sky's the limit optimism, shown, and this is the most important thing, in a stately, controlled way, the emotion always gathered, contained, subject to the tight, rigorous constraints of masking tape and other modes of tempering the outburst, ecstasy and austerity together, the good cheer always flowing in narrow channels of gravity, in a heraldry of official feelings, akin to Kennedy's own bright but measured proclamations. Why, though, would just these artists, Lewis, Noland, and Feely, be the only abstract painters who could officially portray the Kennedy ethos? The Kennedy White House, after all, endorsed and drew to itself a wide range of abstract art, all testifying to the new presidency's greater glory. But, you know, not every abstract painter was cut out to be a court painter. So, for example, Kennedy invited Mark Rothko to the inaugural dinner. And Rothko, whose work Black on Maroon from 1958-59 you see here, was then at the height of his career, having just opened a one-person retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, and he was the first abstract expressionist to be so honored. But I don't think you need me to tell you that Rothko's gloomy, wine-dark pictures, they kind of cast their gloom out upon all of you right now in the darkness of this auditorium. These gloomy, wine-dark pictures were too grim by far, too mordantly emotional to be the right, dignified thing. These paintings were commissioned for the Four Seasons restaurant in the brand new Seagram building in Midtown Manhattan, and with them, with their oppressive, haunted atmospheres, Rothko had intended, with these smoky red voids, to, as he said, ruin the appetite of every self-important mover and shaker, every dynamic new man and woman who dared to dine under their plaintive, morbid emptiness. So, no, Rothko was too much the depressive artist of grievance, too tragic, too emotional, never more so than in 1961, and though he was certainly an impressive philosophical addition to the roster of inauguration dinner grandees, he was no court painter. But what about Elaine de Kooning? Willem de Kooning's wife, also a painter. She was commissioned to make a portrait of Kennedy for the Truman Library in 1962. And the photograph you're looking at, showing her in Palm Beach at work on the picture, gives the proceeding, it's true, a dignified, official air. She stands off to one side, neatly dressed and separated from the president and his associate by a reflective screen, a large pad of drawing paper, and her canvas and easel. Her position of deference, intimate yet remote, recalls the placement of the court artist in pictures such as Velázquez's great Las Meninas, for example. She, too, is the painter before royalty. And one of the many portraits that Elaine de Kooning ended up making as a result of this commission shows the president, it's true, in an informal but still arguably dignified pose, his command intact. So then Elaine de Kooning as a court painter? I think, again, not. The gestural brushwork of this painting, for example, one of the some 23 she made, just wasn't exactly in keeping with official presidential dignity. Though it's not as wild as it seems, it largely repeats the vertical orientation of the canvas, and it doesn't distort Kennedy's form. De Kooning's painterly handling too much recalls the Dionysian expressiveness of her other pictures and those of her husband, Willem. So no, probably even though it was intended as such, this kind of picture could not really count for us as official court painting. But surely we have here a kind that might. Maybe. The grandfatherly abstractionist Hans Hofmann, the painter whose art inspired the term abstract expressionist in the first place, admired Kennedy a great deal, and his eulogy of 1963, which you're looking at, called To JFK, 1,000 Roots Did Die With Thee, is a sign, at the very least, of the deep affinity between the Kennedy administration and abstract painting in those years. Yet Hofmann was also not right, not as an official painter. Every aspect of his work, it's been pointed out, is so overwrought, so overblown, so embarrassingly emotional. The thick ice cream brushwork, the technicolor colors, the windy, wordy titles like Let There Be Light, Exabundantia, Song of the Nightingale, When Gods Combat. So vulgar or corny, as it's been described by the art historian T.J. Clark, Hofmann's art, so much designed to produce seemingly the sinking, slinking feeling we all get when we watch a needlessly drawn-out make-out session in some movie. The music ascending as the hero and heroine open their mouths, so much like that it could hardly be deemed presidential, official, no matter how honest and earnest its complete and utter liberal adulation. If the music of Gustav Mahler, as conducted by Leonard Bernstein, another ardent Kennedy admirer, was itself prone to exaggeration, extravagance, bombast, obsessive length, if it too was rocked with outpourings of raw feeling and ecstatic modulations, if it was, in the words of a cultural historian, therefore grossly out of step with both Eisenhower-era blandness and Kennedy-era cool, the picture you're looking at was the visual equivalent of Bernstein's Mahler, too heartfelt, too bombastic to be anything other than the unofficial art of the Kennedy administration. But what then about a cooler artist, one closer to the look of Lewis, Noland, and Feely? Gene Davis, one of whose stripe paintings you're looking at, pictures he began making in 1960, would seem to fit the Kennedy bill. Davis lived and worked in Washington, D.C. He'd even had connections to a Democratic president back when he was a White House correspondent during the Truman years. And his trademark paintings, like this one, with their banks of syncopated vertical stripes, it's true, feature no extravagant brushwork or other crude expressive gestures, and thus might seem to be austere enough to be a kind of court painting. Yet there was something out of keeping even with these as portrayals of official instead of just general liberal ideology. They seemed to serious critics at the time, like Michael Fried, to be bound by no severe or rigorous or austere structural principle, to be basically nothing more than a random combination of colors. And beyond that, they show a certain affection for cute, cliché colors, candy box pretty colors, as Davis himself put it, making for a kind of campy pop version of abstraction, gussied up with a frisson of macho gentleness, like it's been said, Kojak sucking on a lollipop, or Frank Sinatra in a peppermint cardigan. So this, too, wouldn't do for the portrayal of dignified presidential emotion. But Lewis's Unfurleds and the works by Noland and Feely, I think, would. Not that there isn't something groovy or cosmic about them. Lewis's art of the early 60s, for the most part, for me, evokes the joyous and naive energy of, say, the Beatles' Please, Please Me of 1962. But also with their bright, trippy colors, the Unfurleds also anticipate the psychedelic invitation of Magical Mystery Tour of 1967. And this is especially true, for me, of the Unfurleds that contain fewer and fatter stripes, pictures that seem funkier and chancier, more random. They're more bulbous flows taking on a lava lamp amorphousness out of keeping with Lewis at his coat and tie, most dignified official best. Though even the kind of official pictures like Alpha Tau, it's true, have a kind of Strawberry Fields flavor to them, or maybe a bit of Day Tripper, with each color like a note in the distinctive opening refrain of that song from 1965, that year when the old innocent Beatles start commingling fascinatingly with the more hirsute countercultural preachers they were to become. And as you look at this picture, it's no wonder overall that critics back in the 60s, intent on making Lewis the hippest of them all, would say that he made his pictures really spontaneously, free-handedly, that he even left decisions about their final dimensions to the whim of gallery owners and other handlers. No wonder that they'd say this, these critics, but also totally wrong. For if there is some kind of incipiently hallucinogenic quality to these pictures, if there is just a little bit the nascent aura of Austin Powers creeping around the work of Noland and Feely, there's much more decisively the reserve, the rigor, the puritanical restraint that Greenberg correctly saw in these works. Greenberg, who lambasted those who wanted to make Lewis into the most, as he said, far-out painter there ever was. Lambasted because Lewis was, finally, and let's be clear about this, not so very far out at all. Which raises the question, if Lewis, Noland, and Feely were so apt as official painters of the Kennedy White House, how exactly could this have been so? The Kennedy administration did not explicitly, officially encourage their art. Nothing could be further from the truth. But there are some tantalizing connections, and take the picture on the screen. It's one of the paintings Lewis began making in 1961 after he moved on from the Unfurleds. It's called Water Shot, and it was purchased in October 1961 by one of the most powerful, influential liberals in America, the novelist and journalist James Michener, best known now for his mammoth, some would say interminable, historical novels, usually topping out at over 1,000 pages, the first of which was Hawaii, published in 1959. Now, Michener, a longtime Democrat, had decided in that same year, 1959, to throw in his lot with Kennedy. He led the Citizens for Kennedy Committee in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where he lived, and he campaigned for Kennedy in the summer and fall of 1960. He published a book about those experiences the next year, the year he purchased the picture you're looking at. And in 1962, Michener spent 9 months campaigning as a Democrat for a seat in the United States Congress, trying and ultimately failing to unseat a 26-year Republican incumbent. Now, in the midst of all this, Michener purchased Watershot, adding it to his collection of modern American art, which he toured around the country in 1962 and 63 to Little Rock, Kansas City, Allentown, and other places in a challenge to ongoing dowdy Eisenhowerian cultural standards. So here and elsewhere, there's a letter in 1961, for example, from Sergeant Shriver, head of the Peace Corps and John F. Kennedy's brother-in-law, expressing interest in Lewis and Noland. Here and elsewhere, there's a connection between Lewis's abstraction and liberal politics, a connection that's maybe even intrinsic in the work, too, since Lewis made the picture you're looking at, after all, during the Kennedy years, as if he somehow had its values in mind. Now, could this be said of Alpha Tau as well? Well, it is true that Lewis made his many dozens of Unfurleds all between early summer 1960 and late spring 1961. All of them. a time coinciding with Kennedy's campaign, election, inauguration, and first few months in office. And it's true, too, that Lewis made all these works in his home in northwest Washington, D.C., just a few miles from the White House. And yes, it's also true that Lewis was an old liberal from way back, even a very left liberal from his days working for the WPA in the 1930s. And yes, it's also true that he was an avid newspaper reader with an acute understanding of political and economic issues, according to his widow. And yes, it was true even beyond that, that Lewis was, Marcella Brenner, the widow, has said, an excellent prognosticator of political events. As a matter of fact, uncomfortably so. All these things are true, but Lewis and the others, let's remember, were still unknowns outside the art world and even partly within the art world when Kennedy took office. All were artists priding themselves on a hermetic, apolitical devotion to painting, and isolation especially characterizing Lewis, who never even saw one of his Unfurleds displayed in a gallery or museum. So then, is finally the relation between these works and Kennedy just a coincidence of Apollonian rhetoric, an artistic kind and a political kind, mutually high-minded but otherwise unrelated, passing each other by, unknown in the night? Or was the relation more direct somehow? And I have an idea about how this might have been so as we look at a photograph of Noland in his Bennington studio. And my idea is that it is the ideal of patronage. The ideal of patronage, it was that acted as an enabling fantasy for these artists. A fantasy about making pictures for a ruler, even if that ruler did not really commission them. A fantasy that would be very productive, since it would give these artists a chance to go beyond the played-out stratagems of merely individual artistic independence, what a bore, or of formalist innovation, and instead imagine themselves as making their art in the name of a higher cause, a greater inspiration, as making their art at a time, in other words, when art actually mattered. This fantasy of patronage would have its main importance, as far as Lewis and the others were concerned, not as an act of political endorsement, though it surely was that, but as a means of calling for, even demanding, a pictorial extravagance and an obsession with rules of decorum that would generate all the rich, striking visual effects, big and small, without which art of this kind would be either too capricious, that is, too much motivated by only personal artistic choices, or too parochial, that is, too much beholden to an aridly inconsequential formalism measured by minute adjustments of color, line, and so on. Rubens was one sign of this grandiosity, this fantasy of grandeur, this dream of painting as though made for courts and kings. Rubens was in the air in the early 1960s. Willem de Kooning was busy working through the Flemish master's paintings, exulting in all the bombast, reveling in the vulgarity of it all, as in the picture from 1964 on the left called Clam Diggers, with its Long Island Andromedas shimmying in ripples of flesh-colored water, a direct riff on Rubens's Andromeda there on the right. But Lewis's engagement with Rubens, the one that artist Frank Stella intuited, was less conscious and more profound, not a matter of any kind of one-for-one correlation that I can point to, because there is none, but more a matter of the sheer and simple and oh-so-powerful painterly delight to be had in making a picture. More a matter of that delight than vulgarity, more a matter of trying for Lewis to share, to inhabit the great Flemish painter's sheer pleasure in the act of painting, his faith in the power of painting to affect a spectator, a royal spectator even, worthy of being so stunned. Lewis's assurance of hedonistic gesture, his dexterity of flourish, matches Rubens's precision of exuberance. The way Rubens could, as someone said once, I don't remember where, throw away the orange after just one squeeze. And it calls to mind Lewis's effrontery, that is, to affect us almost viscerally, Rubens's bold gambits on the viewer's space. The surge and splendor of the Unfurleds, in other words, uses Rubens, something like that, some kind of court painting, to conjure an imagined world of pomp and importance beyond the art world, to imagine painting in the service of something beyond the galleries and museums, to dream of painting as it might have been in the age of Rubens, painting in the name of monarchs and popes, summoning its best effects, its boldest and most flourishing designs, all in the name of official ideologies. Lebrun was the other sign of this fantasy, this dream of making paintings for a court. Lebrun, the maker of giant pictures like Rubens, but also Lebrun, the fastidious painter of detail, making sure every last expression is just scientifically so, calibrated to that careful, exact sharpness. Lebrun, who helps us understand Lewis's detail, his almost manic quest for order, for the sharp, clear, delimited edge, the just so curving of expression into a careful design. This quest, like Nolan's and Feely's quest, going way beyond the basic requirements to just make a rigorous art, to set everything down with a care and a neatness, a scrupulous regard for order. So you see, if Lewis's paintings, and this is the right part of Alpha Tau, if Lewis's paintings, like Nolan's, make much of adjusting a stripe of color 1/8 of an inch, or of letting the tip of a chevron touch, or just fail to touch, the bottom framing edge of the canvas, they do so not to propound some tiny adjustment to the canons of modern art. That would be thrilling, wouldn't it? But instead, in the manner of a court painter, judging the effect of a pinky raised or lowered, a button buttoned or unbuttoned, a brow creased or calm, on the ruler whose Olympian presence knows and calibrates the meaning of all gestures, all signs, big and small. Clement Greenberg might seem to be this ruler. Greenberg, Lewis's special champion, the reputation maker, advising, hovering over the painter's achievements, the critic as king of the art world, as he definitely was in those years. There he is in a characteristically arrogant pose. But saying this, that Greenberg was the ruler, misses the sheer grandiosity of Alpha Tau and the other Unfurleds. Greenberg was telling Lewis, in fact, to go smaller, make smaller paintings in those years, to get rid of all the empty canvas, and basically to make paintings practically sized enough that someone would actually want to buy one of them. That is, to make a painting that someone could fit into his or her living room. But Lewis, meanwhile, was going for big, bigger, and emptier, and more audaciously empty and big than anything Greenberg could ever have dreamed of. Making pictures, the Unfurleds, like Alpha Tau, impractical for and indifferent to the realities of a mere art market. Pictures intended, if only symbolically, for grander audiences and grander spaces than Greenberg and the art galleries. It's best then last to say that Alpha Tau and the other Unfurleds derive their power, their conviction as paintings, the thing that makes them worth exhibiting in this museum right now, from a fantasy of patronage. Call it a patron effect, a way of imagining the work in its grand size and in its smallest details, too, as always subject to the approval of a ruler. And it's best, too, to say that the artists themselves work so ambitiously and so carefully, not from a sense of following in a modernist progression, of heeding this, that, or the other aesthetical rule, but from a fantasy of being what painters like Lebrun and Rubens were, courtiers, deferential and circumspect, willing to serve selflessly the cause of a ruler whose divinity might inspire their art in ways unthinkable without that patronage. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The paintings of Lewis, Noland, and Feely heed that call. Thank you. And for those of you who would like to stay, I will entertain some questions. And Ashley has a microphone which we'd like for you to speak the question into.
Your lecture was a lot to absorb. I wanted to ask a question sort of on the side of this. Do you think that Morris Louis being Jewish and had anything to do with his paintings? And I know that his wife posthumously titled many of the works, but you have other artists like Barnett Newman who were working involved in this.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because you've focused on so many other parts about his work, and I wondered.
The Charred Journal series, of which one is on display, are about book burning. They're about the Holocaust. I could believe that Morris Louis Bernstein's Jewishness actually fits into what I was saying, that there might be some sort of alignment between a Jewish artistic intellectual culture and the Kennedy administration. That's part of this too. I think perhaps in other ways, though, your question is profound. I mean, go ahead.
As such, like the Decalogue, not using imagery and such in terms of understanding and looking at his work, and just I thought of a lot of things today while you were talking.
Yes, no, it's an excellent question, and I don't have a perfect answer for it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for the paper. I wonder if you could describe the experience or your own experience of the kind of experience you think is at stake here. Or, I mean, are you calling upon your own experience in order to speak to this kind of expressivity or emotion or experience that you're speaking to in terms of a kind of a courtly effect?
Are you saying, how did I come up with this, or are you saying, can you just elaborate?
Oh, no, I wonder if you could give it, if you could speak to it in terms of your own experience, because you mentioned Alpha Tau as one of the earliest canvases, and I find that I like the emphasis on it, but I also find my own kind of experiences of experience rare. So I wondered if you could speak to the kind of that kind of experience.
Well, if I understand you right, I mean, that's a meaningful painting to me because I grew up with it. I think it's very much more worthwhile, maybe the only thing to do if you have a job like yours or mine, to write about works that before which you have some kind of powerful experience, and therefore not to write in some kind of merely academic way. But I maybe getting a little more to the point of your question, I just feel that standing in front of those pictures is intuitively to be in front of a 17th century painting. So I don't know if this is what you mean by experience, but that's my experience, my intuition, my kind of critic's response to this, that as I tried to suggest, the bombast, the size, the extravagance, the lushness these pictures seem to want to recall an era, for example, the 17th century, which I happen to love, as to recall an era when painting had that kind of rich, lush assurance, and to want to think in the 1960s about the fantasy, at least, because it could be only a fantasy of giving painting that power, that lushness again.
Kind of picking up on that, I guess, do you see any kind of, well, toward the end of their talk, you just began to touch on the emptiness that began to grow in the canvases, right? And while I wouldn't necessarily equate that with, I think the Rothko quote was something about a mordant emptiness, right? For me, some of that blankness offsets the shine or glimmer or optimism in the Unfurleds, right? So I'm wondering if there's an acknowledgement, if you see an acknowledgement in Lewis's painting of the impossibility of that kind of patron effect, right? That there's an acknowledgement of the distance that's been traveled between
Yeah, that's nice.
17th century
It
painting.
depends on how you read those big empty centers. They could be, going back to the first question about the Holocaust, they could be like giving over vast spaces of even the most sumptuous painting now must be, and even in their very centers, empty. So there's a kind of pathos to it, and there's a kind of spaceless void that is almost Rothko-like in a sense, because you could say it's similarly morbid. I tend to see it as just kind of like, more of this kind of bravura, dazzling, dizzying, kind of dawning, Kennedy-like imagery of dawning and new eras and brightness, because indeed that is the effect before it, is this kind of shimmer or optical dazzle produced by that blankness. But it's a very good question. Yeah.
I was interested in what you said about the dispassionate emotions that Lewis exhibited in his paintings, but I was also curious because behind the Kennedy administration was a great deal of chaos and sexual emotions and things, and how, I was just curious, would Lewis have known that at the time, and was he just glossing over what was really going on and just approaching it from another level?
I don't think very many people at all knew anything about that. That would be the dark side of Camelot that's come out and is a commonplace of our own understanding of that time. But even, I think Lewis's paintings match the official public image of the Kennedy administration, and they make, nor could they make, any kind of claim about some probing of the inner workings or kind of vulgar actualities of that White House.
So would it be more of an idealistic
yes.
look at?
Yeah, it's really, it's like the inauguration speech, idealistic in that sense. A new vision, let us begin. Yes, exactly.
Any other questions?
Up there, I guess.
Oh.
You have to throw the microphone. Or I'll paraphrase your question. Okay. Well, this man right here would probably have more to say about that. To put it crudely, I'm the 60s guy, or at least I am tonight. And this is a 50s guy down here. But you should speak, yeah. Yes, of course. If I can, thank you, Jeffrey. The question is Lewis's art in the 50s and the design elements of it. Can you just say a little bit more about that? Go ahead. Yeah, please say just say it one more time, and I'll paraphrase it. Yes. On the part of his audiences? Okay. So the question is, Lewis in the 50s, how much did he take for granted that his audiences would know about the kinds of pictures, the veils, for example, he was making then? I would guess that they were off the charts, unrecognizable to most people who were even somewhat sort of amenable to modern and maybe even abstract art. Clement Greenberg thought they were majestic as soon as he unrolled them in New York in 1954, the first set. But I think they were profoundly different from expected forms of abstraction, different from Pollock's, for example.
Okay, and I think we'll take one more question, and then you can just talk to him after, if you would like to.
Well, I was just wondering, in the 50s, or let's say late 50s and early 60s, the possibilities in the production of paint, like acrylic that he could pour, or the magna that he used, may have also been a player in this question related to the gentleman upstairs. That the paint itself was made available to artists to be used on that scale and to be poured and pushed around the way Morris Louis desired, even though he had some of the paint he had manufactured for him.
Well, the brightness of the paint would not have been surprising then, yes, because it was a known quantity, yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. Have a nice evening.